At 01:15 hours on June 6, 1944, a German staff car tore through the darkness of the Norman countryside. Its headlights were dimmed, the road was narrow. The engine groaned as the driver pushed it harder than it was meant to go. Inside the car sat Lieutenant General Wilhelm Falley, commander of the 91st Luftland Infantry Division. He leaned forward, eyes fixed on the black ribbon of road ahead. Above him, the night sky roared. It was not the distant rumble of artillery, not the isolated drone of a patrol aircraft. This was something else entirely. Thousands of engines all at once, rolling across the sky like thunder that did not fade. Falley had never heard a sound like it. Just hours earlier, he had been more than 100 miles away, attending a war exercise in Rennes. The scenario had been precise. An Allied invasion of France, airborne landings, confusion behind the lines, German commanders scrambling to respond. Now the exercise was over, and the sound overhead told him the war game had followed him home. The invasion was real. Falley knew what that sound meant. Transport aircraft, hundreds of them, maybe more. If Allied paratroopers were already in the air, then they would not be landing on the beaches. They would be landing behind him, on his roads, in his fields, near his headquarters. He urged the driver to go faster. The roads of Normandy were not built for speed. Stone walls closed in on either side. Trees bent overhead, swallowing what little moonlight remained. In the distance, faint flashes lit the horizon. Anti-aircraft fire, waking up too late. Falley's division existed for one purpose, to counter airborne landings. He had trained for this moment, prepared for it, studied it in classrooms and on maps. But nothing in those exercises had prepared him for this sound. As the staff car raced through the darkness, Falley could not know that American paratroopers were already falling from the sky. Some were landing in flooded fields. Some were crashing through rooftops. Some were dying before their boots ever touched French soil. Others were gathering quietly in the dark. By the time Falley reached his headquarters, the war behind the Atlantic Wall would already be unfolding without him. For months before the invasion, the most dangerous part of the plan was not the beaches. It was the sky. Allied commanders knew that dropping thousands of paratroopers behind enemy lines had never been done on this scale. The men would fly low and slow, directly into German anti-aircraft fire. Navigation would depend on darkness, weather, and fragile radio signals. If anything went wrong, the paratroopers would be scattered, isolated, and destroyed before dawn. No one argued this more forcefully than Air Chief Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory. Lee Mallory had studied the flight paths. He had examined German flak positions. He had run the numbers again and again, and each time the conclusion was the same. He predicted catastrophic losses, not just among the paratroopers, but among the transport aircraft themselves. Entire formations, he believed, would be torn apart before they ever reached Normandy. In late May 1944, with the invasion only days away, Lee Mallory took his objections directly to the highest authority he could find, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. On May 29th, Lee Mallory formally recommended that the American airborne drops be canceled. He called the operation a futile slaughter. Men would be dropped into chaos, he warned, only to die alone in the dark. Eisenhower listened. He understood the risk better than anyone in the room. He knew that the paratroopers would be scattered, that many would never find their units, that some would drown in flooded fields or be cut down before they could even free themselves from their parachutes. But Eisenhower also understood what would happen without them. Behind Utah Beach lay flooded marshes and narrow causeways. If defenders reached those choke points first, they could trap the landing troops on the sand and destroy them in hours. Naval gunfire could not reach far enough inland. Armor would arrive too late. The paratroopers were the only force that could be there in time. If they failed, the invasion might collapse before it truly began. If they succeeded, even partially, they could buy the Allies the most precious resource of all: time. In the end, Eisenhower made his decision. The airborne assault would go forward, and once the order was given, there would be no way to call the men back. On the night of June 5, 1944, General Dwight D. Eisenhower left his headquarters and drove to Greenham Common Airfield. The runways were crowded with aircraft. Rows of C-47 transport planes stood ready, their engines ticking as they cooled in the night air. Mechanics moved quietly beneath their wings. Paratroopers sat on benches or crates, checking straps, tightening buckles, smoking their last cigarettes. Eisenhower did not arrive to give a speech. He walked among the men. He shook hands, asked where they were from, listened as young soldiers told him about farms in Iowa, factories in Pennsylvania, small towns most Americans had never heard of. Many of the men had darkened their faces with grease or charcoal. Some had shaved their hair into mohawks, a gesture meant to look fierce, but also to hide fear. They knew the odds. They knew they might never see daylight again. Eisenhower could see it in their eyes, the tension, the resolve, the quiet acceptance. These were not hardened veterans. Many were barely out of their teens. In a few hours, they would be dropped into enemy territory with no guarantee of support, no clear idea of where they would land, and little hope of rescue if things went wrong. Photographs taken that night show Eisenhower smiling. But when he left the airfield, the weight of the decision settled fully on him. Back at his headquarters, Eisenhower sat alone at a desk and wrote a short statement on a single sheet of paper. It was not a message of victory. It was a message of responsibility. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it read, it is mine alone. He folded the paper and placed it in his pocket. Within hours, thousands of aircraft would be crossing the channel. Thousands of lives would be committed to a single irreversible moment, and there would be no more decisions left to make. To understand why the airborne landings mattered, you have to look past the beaches. The Atlantic Wall was never meant to stop an invasion at the water's edge alone. Behind the sand and the concrete lay the real battlefield, the countryside of Normandy itself. Fields were divided by thick hedgerows. Roads sank below ground level, forming natural trenches. Villages were connected by narrow causeways that could be defended by a handful of men. And in the lowlands of the Cotentin Peninsula, the Germans had deliberately turned the land into a weapon. Months before the invasion, German engineers had opened sluice gates and blocked drainage canals. Water spread across fields and meadows, flooding vast stretches of terrain. From the air, the land still looked solid. On the ground, it was mud and standing water, deep enough to drown a man weighed down by equipment. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel believed the invasion would be decided in the first hours. If the Allies could be contained at the beaches, he believed, they could be destroyed before their strength mattered. Rommel pushed relentlessly to fortify the coast. Concrete bunkers, artillery positions, machine gun nests covering every approach. He ordered millions of mines laid and obstacles planted in the surf to rip open landing craft. But Rommel worried just as much about the sky. Fields that could support glider landings were transformed into deadly traps. Wooden stakes were driven into the earth at sharp angles, many topped, with mines or artillery shells rigged to explode on impact. The troops called them Rommel's asparagus. Entire meadows became forests of sharpened poles, designed to tear gliders apart and kill the men inside before they could escape. Yet even Rommel knew the defenses were incomplete. Concrete was in short supply. Labor was stretched thin. Many fortifications existed only on maps. The units assigned to hold them were often second-rate. Older soldiers, men recovering from wounds, conscripts from occupied countries with little loyalty to Germany. The elite formations, the panzer divisions that could truly counter an invasion, were held inland. And even among Germany's commanders, there was no agreement on how they should be used. One side believed the armor must be close to the beaches, ready to strike immediately. The other insisted it be held back until the main landing was identified. The compromise satisfied no one. If the Allies achieved surprise, the German response would be slow. And if the response was slow, the Atlantic Wall would be broken, not from the front, but from behind. The Allied answer to Germany's defenses was both simple and reckless. Before a single soldier landed on the beaches, thousands would be dropped behind them. In the early hours of June 6th, more than 13,000 American paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions would jump into occupied France. They would land in darkness, scattered across more than 30 square kilometers of countryside, surrounded on all sides by enemy forces. Their mission was not to defeat the Germans outright, it was to delay them. Behind Utah Beach, the flooded lowlands left only 4 narrow causeways leading inland. These raised roads were the only routes tanks, artillery, and infantry could use to move off the beach. If German units reached those causeways first, they could choke the invasion at its narrowest point and destroy the landing force before it ever broke out. The paratroopers were ordered to seize and hold those routes at all costs. The 101st Airborne was tasked with securing the causeways themselves, along with key road junctions and bridges. The 82nd Airborne was assigned to capture crossings over the Murderette River and block German counterattacks from the west. Every objective lay miles from the next, separated by hedgerows, flooded fields, and enemy patrols. There would be no tanks to support them, no heavy artillery. Ammunition was limited, resupply was uncertain. Each man carried only what he could jump with. Commanders expected chaos. Aircraft would be scattered by weather and flak. Units would land in the wrong fields. Some men would be killed before they ever assembled. Others would never find their objectives at all. The planners accepted this. They believed that even in disorder, the paratroopers could succeed. Small groups cutting telephone lines, isolated squads ambushing convoys, bridges seized not by battalions, but by handfuls of men acting on initiative rather than orders. If enough of them did this, the German response would slow. Confusion would spread, orders would be delayed, and if the Germans were delayed, even for a few hours, the men coming ashore at Utah Beach would have a chance to survive. The airborne troops would be sacrificed not for territory, but for time. 30 minutes before the main airborne assault, the first Americans crossed into occupied France. They were called the Pathfinders. Their job was brutally simple. Jump ahead of the main force, locate the drop zones, and mark them so the following aircraft could find their targets in the dark. Without them, the entire airborne operation would be blind. Each Pathfinder team carried specialized equipment: Eureka radar beacons to guide aircraft, signal lamps to mark landing areas, and small panels meant to be visible only from the air. They trained to land, assemble, and set up their signals in just minutes. But almost nothing went as planned. Low clouds rolled in from the channel, thicker than expected. Navigation lights were dimmed to avoid detection. Pilots struggled to identify landmarks through gaps in the weather. German flak began to fire, forcing aircraft to break formation. When the Pathfinders jumped, many were already off course. Some teams landed miles from their assigned drop zones. Others fell into flooded fields, struggling to keep their equipment above water. A few were shot at as they descended, their parachutes briefly illuminated by searchlights before vanishing into the darkness. On the ground, confusion spread. Eureka beacons malfunctioned or were damaged on landing. Signal lamps were lost or broken. Teams that were supposed to link up never found each other. In several areas, Pathfinders realized they had no idea where they were. Only one American drop zone was correctly marked that night. Everywhere else, the signals were late, incomplete, or missing entirely. By the time the main body of transport aircraft approached the Normandy coast, the carefully planned network of guides below them had already failed. The pilots would have to make their runs anyway, and the men waiting in the aircraft had no idea that the ground meant to receive them was now almost completely unmarked. Shortly after midnight, the first waves of American transport aircraft reached the coast of France. From the ground, they arrived without warning. German radar stations had detected movement over the channel, but the scale was impossible to grasp. Then, the flak batteries opened fire. White and red bursts tore open the sky, forcing pilots to climb, dive, and scatter to survive. Inside the C-47s, the noise was overwhelming. Engines thundered at full power. Anti-aircraft shells exploded close enough to rock the aircraft. Red warning lights bathed the interiors in a dull glow as paratroopers sat shoulder to shoulder, weighed down by rifles, ammunition, radios, explosives, and reserve parachutes. Many of the men were already sick. The aircraft were flying low and fast, weaving through clouds and smoke. Turbulence threw men against the fuselage. Some vomited onto the metal floors. Others clutched their weapons and stared straight ahead, trying not to think about what waited below. Green lights were supposed to come on only over the drop zones, but navigation was collapsing. Pilots struggled to identify landmarks through cloud breaks. Some aircraft overshot their targets. Others turned too early. Under heavy fire, formations disintegrated, and aircraft began dropping paratroopers wherever the crew believed they might be. In several planes, the green light came on too soon. Men stood, hooked up, and jumped into darkness they did not recognize. Paratroopers fell into hedgerows, orchards, flooded fields, and villages. Some slammed into trees and were left hanging helplessly above the ground. Others hit water and disappeared. Beneath the surface, dragged down by the weight of their gear. Equipment bundles scattered across the countryside. Radios shattered. Mortars vanished into mud. Units that had trained together for years were now separated by miles. By the time the last aircraft turned back toward England, the airborne plan existed only on paper. On the ground below, thousands of Americans were alone, and the night was just beginning. By the time the parachutes collapsed into the hedgerows, the airborne invasion had dissolved into fragments. Men lay scattered across the Norman countryside, separated from their units, their officers, and often their weapons. Some landed alone. Others gathered in twos and threes, whispering passwords into the dark, unsure if the next voice they heard would answer in English or German. For many, the first battle was against the land itself. Flooded fields swallowed paratroopers whole. Heavy packs dragged men under the surface as they struggled to cut themselves free. Rifles vanished into black water. Some soldiers drowned only meters from dry ground, unheard and unseen in the darkness. Those who survived moved carefully. They cut away parachutes and hid them. They followed hedgerows instead of roads. Every shadow became a possible ambush. Every sound, a snapped branch, a splash, a distant shout, brought fingers to triggers. German units were just as confused. Reports flooded headquarters from every direction. Paratroopers here, gunfire there. Bridges attacked by unknown forces. No one could say how many Americans had landed or where the main effort lay. Small groups of paratroopers began to act on instinct. A lieutenant with 6 men ambushed a German patrol and disappeared again into the fields. A sergeant blew a culvert with explosives meant for a bridge miles away. 2 soldiers cut telephone lines, then moved on to the next pole, and the next. There were no maps that matched the ground, no schedules that still applied. Radios, when they worked at all, carried only fragments of information. The war had become personal. Rank mattered less than initiative. Orders were replaced by intent. Every man understood the same simple truth: do as much damage as possible, for as long as possible, before daylight exposed them. Some groups would never know if they succeeded. Some would be wiped out within hours. But across the darkened countryside, dozens of these small, unplanned actions began to overlap. And slowly, invisibly, the German response began to slow. Brigadier General James Gavin hit the ground like any other paratrooper. There was no staff car waiting for him, no headquarters, no radio contact with his division. He landed in the early hours of June 6th in a flooded field, weighed down by equipment, water creeping up around his legs as he cut himself free. Gavin was 37 years old. He was the youngest general in the U.S. Army, and he had insisted on jumping with his men. He did not know where he was. He did not know where most of his division had landed, and he did not wait for answers. Moving through the darkness, Gavin began to gather whoever he could find. Paratroopers from different regiments, different companies. Some had lost their weapons. Others carried nothing but ammunition and grenades. A few were wounded, but refused to stop. There were no formal orders to give. Gavin told them only what mattered. They were behind enemy lines. The invasion was underway. German counterattacks were coming. Their job was to block them, and so they moved. Without maps that made sense, Gavin oriented himself by sound and instinct. Gunfire in the distance marked where others were already fighting. Bridges and road junctions became magnets, drawing small groups of Americans toward them from every direction. When they encountered German positions, they did not wait to be reinforced. They attacked. A machine gun nest was silenced with grenades and rifle fire. Roadblock was overrun before it could be fully manned. German patrols stumbled into Americans they never knew were there. To the Germans, it felt like facing a force far larger than it truly was. Gavin later wrote that the chaos of the night became an advantage. With no clear front line, the Americans were everywhere and nowhere at once. Orders did not have to travel down chains of command. Decisions were made on the spot. Every small success built momentum. By the time dawn approached, Gavin had no idea how many men he truly commanded, but he knew one thing. The Germans were reacting to him, not the other way around. As the night wore on, German headquarters across Normandy struggled to understand what was happening. Reports arrived from every direction. Paratroopers had landed near Sainte-Mère-Église. Others were fighting near the Merderet River. Bridges were under attack. Roads were cut. Telephone lines went dead almost as soon as they were repaired. None of the reports agreed. Some officers believed they were facing small reconnaissance units. Others were convinced entire divisions had landed in their sector. Units were ordered to move, then told to halt, then redirected again as new information arrived, and contradicted what came before. Communication broke down quickly. Field telephones had been severed. Radio traffic overlapped and jammed itself into confusion. Messengers sent by motorcycle never arrived. Those who did brought outdated information by the time they reached their destination. The German defensive system relied on clarity. It depended on knowing where the enemy was landing, identifying the main effort, and striking it with speed and concentration. That clarity never came. Instead, commanders faced a battlefield without a center. Every road seemed threatened. Every village reported contact. Every movement risked running straight into American ambushes that appeared without warning and vanished just as quickly. Requests for armored support moved slowly up the chain of command. Authority was fragmented. Some decisions required approval from higher headquarters that could not be reached, or did not yet believe the invasion was underway. In the early hours of June 6th, precious time slipped away. The longer the confusion lasted, the harder it became to assemble a coherent counterattack. Units meant to move decisively hesitated, waiting for confirmation that never arrived. The Americans, scattered and outnumbered, were shaping the battlefield simply by being everywhere at once, and at the center of this growing confusion stood a critical absence. The commander of the 91st Division was still on the road. Lieutenant General Wilhelm Falle never reached his headquarters. After leaving Rennes, he had driven through the night toward his command post near Picoville. He expected to find a division preparing to counter airborne landings, exactly the scenario he had rehearsed hours earlier. Instead, he drove into a battlefield that no longer followed any plan. The roads were darker than usual. Traffic was absent. Telephone lines sagged from broken poles. In the distance, sporadic gunfire echoed from directions that made no sense. Falle sat rigid in the back seat, listening. He knew paratroopers were down. He did not yet know how many or where. What he did know was that time mattered. Every minute without direction allowed the enemy to dig in deeper behind the lines. As the staff car approached a crossroads near his headquarters, it slowed. The driver could not see them. A small group of American paratroopers lay hidden along the roadside. Men from different units, dropped miles from where they were supposed to be. They had no orders to be there, no knowledge of who was coming, only the instinct to stop anything German that moved. When the car came within range, they opened fire. Rifle shots shattered the silence. The windshield exploded. The driver slumped forward. The vehicle veered off the road and came to a violent stop. Wilhelm Falle was killed almost instantly. He became the first German general to die on D-Day. The men who shot him did not know his name. They did not know his rank. They did not know what they had changed. They melted back into the darkness, just another lost group in a broken night. By the time dawn approached, the 91st Division was leaderless, and the chance for an organized German counterattack in that sector was gone. The ambush itself lasted only seconds. There was no warning, no shouted challenge, no chance to surrender. The American paratroopers were lying low along the roadside, exhausted, wet, and unsure of their surroundings. They had been dropped miles from their objective, cut off from command, acting on nothing but instinct and training. In the darkness, the sound of an approaching engine was enough. When the staff car entered the kill zone, rifles came up almost as one, muzzle flashes, ripped through the night. Bullets punched through glass and metal. The driver was hit immediately. The car lurched, swerved, and slammed to a halt in a ditch beside the road. Then it was over. The paratroopers did not rush forward. They did not search the vehicle. They did not know who they had hit, and they did not wait to find out. German units could be anywhere. Staying still meant dying. They faded back into the hedgerows, disappearing into the same darkness that had delivered them there. Inside the wrecked car, Wilhelm Fally lay dead. There would be no last orders issued, no final attempt to impose control on a collapsing situation. At the exact moment when clarity was needed most, the man trained to respond to an airborne invasion was gone. By the time word reached German headquarters that Fally had been killed, the damage was already done. Orders stalled, decisions were deferred, units waited for direction that never came. What had begun as a random encounter on a dark road became something far larger. A single accidental ambush had removed the nerve center of an entire sector, and the invasion moved forward. The death of General Fally did not end the fighting, it reshaped it. With the commander of the 91st Division gone, the German response in that sector lost its center of gravity. Orders that should have been issued before dawn were delayed or never given at all. Units waited for direction that did not come, while others acted independently, without coordination or support. The division most responsible for countering the airborne landings was suddenly leaderless at the moment it mattered most. Staff officers attempted to fill the gap, but the situation was already slipping beyond control. Reports continued to arrive late and incomplete. Some exaggerated the American strength, others dismissed it entirely. No one could say where the main threat lay. As a result, German forces hesitated. Battalions that should have moved aggressively toward the drop zones stayed in place. Armor that might have crushed small groups of paratroopers remained idle, awaiting authorization that was still winding its way through a broken command structure. Those hours were priceless. Along the causeways behind Utah Beach, American paratroopers, many of them far from their assigned objectives, fought to hold ground they had never planned to occupy. They ambushed convoys, knocked out roadblocks, and forced German units to deploy defensively rather than attack decisively. When the first waves hit Utah Beach at dawn, they did not meet the concentrated resistance planners had feared. German strongpoints existed, but coordination was weak. Counterattacks came piecemeal, late, and without clear leadership. The feared collapse of the landing force never materialized. By mid-morning, American troops were moving inland. The airborne operation, judged strictly by maps and objectives, had failed. Most units had landed in the wrong places. Many objectives were taken late, or not at all. But in effect, it had succeeded beyond expectation. The paratroopers had not seized the battlefield by design. They had fractured it. And in those fractured hours, the fate of Utah Beach and the western flank of the invasion was decided. In the days that followed D-Day, the airborne landings were studied on maps and marked in red pencil. By those measures, they looked like a failure. Units were scattered, objectives were missed, timetables collapsed within minutes of the first jump. Reports listed men killed, missing, or still unaccounted for, lost somewhere in the hedgerows and flooded fields of Normandy. But war is not decided by maps alone. What the airborne troops achieved could not be traced in straight lines or neat arrows. It showed itself in what never happened. There was no decisive German counterattack behind Utah Beach, no armored thrust that cut the invasion in half, no sudden collapse of the fragile beachhead in the first hours when the landing force was most vulnerable. Instead, German commanders hesitated. Units reacted instead of attacking. Armor arrived late, or not at all. The moment passed. The paratroopers had forced the enemy to fight a war of uncertainty. Scattered men, acting without orders, had pulled German attention in every direction at once. A defense designed for precision and timing was overwhelmed by disorder and initiative. One general, trained to stop airborne assaults, never reached his command. Thousands of soldiers who landed in the wrong places ended up exactly where they needed to be. The airborne landings did not win D-Day on their own, but they made it possible. And in the quiet hours after the fighting moved on, the legacy of those men remained, not in the ground they held, but in the time they bought and the invasion they allowed to survive. As dawn broke over Normandy, the noise began to change. The roar of engines faded. Darkness lifted. Smoke drifted across fields that only hours earlier had been silent farmland. Paratroopers emerged from hedgerows, exhausted, dirty, and unsure how many of their own were still alive. Some linked up with advancing troops from the beaches. Others kept fighting where they stood, unaware that the invasion had already taken hold. Along the roads and fields, the traces of the night remained: torn parachutes, abandoned weapons, bodies left where they had fallen. Evidence of a battle that had never followed a plan. Behind the Atlantic Wall, the war had turned, not because everything had gone right, but because enough men had acted when nothing went right. If this is a story worth remembering, it is because it reminds us how history sometimes turns, not on perfect execution, but on individuals who keep moving forward when the plan collapses.